Welcome to Will I Ever Learn Chinese? I'm Jeanette Seikel. In this episode, I'm looking at working with Chinese teachers. I wanted to expand my fluency in a safe setting, so I started to find Chinese teachers. At first, I was searching locally, but then I expanded to searching online. I wanted a one-to-one conversation-style class, rather than sitting in a classroom with others who may have different learning styles to myself and were learning at different speeds. I found various apps where you can find speakers, and I made a shortlist in one of these apps. But then an advertisement caught my eye, and it was from a speaker in China who was about my age and had some interests in common. She was very keen on Chinese medicine as well, something I knew very little about. But it overlapped in some way with herbal medicine and botany that I was interested in, so I thought we would potentially have a number of topics to talk about. These classes were online, however. Was I really happy with that? Well, I hadn't really experienced online classes in the same way before, but I decided to give it a go. Isn't it great, I thought, that today we can just have these exchanges online? It's really straightforward. You can find a speaker in China and work with them. Can we really learn a language to a high level without ever having been to the country where the language is spoken traditionally? Well, I would argue that today that is possible just because of this internet setting where you can speak to a whole range of speakers remotely without ever having to visit the place where the language is spoken. But of course, this is not necessarily something new. We've heard of scholars in the past who were able to speak many languages, sometimes without ever having left their own country. Maybe they had access to one or two speakers where they were living. Maybe they only had access to books. Today, in the digital world though, language learning has become quite straightforward. You can easily interact with speakers across the globe, and you can talk to some people who have never left their own country. You can immerse yourself in the language at home and keep a lot of digital contact with people in China. And at times you may feel almost transported to China this way. The teacher that I had found offered a 30-minute trial, so I was doing this with her, and I found that my intuition had been right. Her Chinese was slow enough for me to understand, but difficult enough for me to feel challenged. I also really liked the pretty straightforward Putonghua, the very straightforward Mandarin Chinese that she was speaking. She had a bit of a northern lilt with the R-hua at the end of words, and that was something I quite liked as well, and it was something I wanted to get better at understanding and using myself. During the 30-minute trial, we talked about my needs, which was to speak the language and to have regular conversations, so through speaking the language, to keep the language going. During this trial, she was very good at suggesting certain words, and she helped me along when I couldn't find the right words. I felt that I was becoming more familiar with using the language, and I enjoyed the session, so I booked regular sessions with her, this time for an hour. The hour-long sessions were really useful. In the first session, we chatted about our daily occurrences, the awful weather in England that day, and the very nice weather in China. I complained about an issue with my heating and learned a lot of relevant vocabulary through talking to her. For example, the button to turn the heating up and down on the radiator is referred to as kaiguan. I knew the two parts separately, but I had not come across this meaning together. Together with my teacher, I had decided not to do lessons as such. That means not to really prepare specific topics. I was not really interested in using a textbook or similar resources, but rather my Chinese was now at a level where I could hold a conversation, and I wanted to apply what I had learned. That included retrieving vocabulary that I had learned, or finding new vocabulary that became relevant in the context, and thereby overall strengthening my use of Chinese and being able to apply it in context. As I was doing these lessons, I started to think even more in Chinese. I started to feel more comfortable in the language. I started to prepare presentations about my research in Chinese, and then later presented in my lessons a slightly more polished version for my teacher. This gave me confidence in speaking and even speaking about topics like my own research. My Chinese conversation lessons were a safe space, and they were not necessarily challenging socially. I paid my teacher, so while I had a really good relationship with her, it was all about my learning of Chinese, rather than a social exchange that would require me to put much more social effort into it. I could solely concentrate on speaking Chinese and trying out new things, trying to use the right words, practicing the language and asking her questions. It soon became apparent that there were things I knew about but was not able to produce myself, and some of those were those little elements that keep discourse flowing and make discourse much more pleasant. Sometimes my brain would go into standstill, and I wouldn't have any words ready to put there when that happened. I also made what I believed at the time quite simple errors, using the wrong negation. There is a negation marker bu and there's a negation marker mei that I used in different contexts. And I knew the difference per se, but in the situation when having to speak, I would sometimes weirdly choose the wrong one despite knowing better. So those were all things I had learned early on, but was apparently not able to produce in quite the same way in rapidly spoken discourse. And through using Chinese in this particular environment, I became better at correcting my own mistakes and finding out where the challenges lay before I had to go out into the real world and try it there. I found that I needed to develop a number of strategies to cope with rapid discourse and with the situations where I didn't quite know the right word to say, or where I needed a little bit more time to sort out the thoughts in my head. Using little words like so-called fillers or discourse markers, they can make your speech appear more fluent. Obviously, there's also something about not panicking. So, when I first started my conversation lessons, I was a bit panicky in my approach, because sometimes I found it quite difficult to speak. I felt a bit like the rabbit caught in the headlights and so on. But as I was getting used to being put on the spot and to speaking with my teacher, I started to relax a bit more. In this case, practice really helped. There were still times, of course, when I felt that my Chinese abilities were not progressing as fast as I really wanted them to. Sometimes I'd discuss something with my teacher, and I would learn some of the vocabulary really well, whereas other things I wouldn't really pick up, and the next time we talk about it, I still wouldn't know that new vocabulary we'd discussed previously. I felt a sense of guilt in those cases, but at the same time, again, let it go and just try to relearn the words and then be able to use them better next time. I realized that sometimes I just needed to step away from the very intensive study of Chinese and let my brain have a chance to breathe. I had experienced something similar with other learning, such as when learning the piano, where I could rehearse a piece many times, but it was only after being away from the piano for 2 days or so that things would suddenly click and I would be able to play it without mistakes. The chance to give my brain a little space to breathe arrived when I had to go to Shetland to work on a project proposal with a colleague. The proposal had absolutely nothing to do with Chinese, and I had to speak Danish initially with one of my colleagues, who's an old friend. She was responding in Swedish. This is the way we have always spoken together since we first met as PhD students. Then another collaborator arrived, and we switched to speaking English. When I came back to Bristol and settled back into my Chinese conversation lessons, I seemed to have jumped in leaps and bounds. I was suddenly so much more confident than before. I was able to use more difficult words. I realized that the break had done me a lot of good, but I realized that time and repetition were also two extremely important factors, and these really could not be skipped. Our brains just simply need time to process new information, and we need to repeatedly be exposed to this information. By having regular conversation classes in this way, I started to become used to regularly speaking Chinese. An hour a week, at a set time. I was soon able to speak without much warning and could switch into Chinese at ease. In the beginning, the classes had been scheduled early in the morning, before the school run and before work. We later switched to lessons during my lunch hour instead. This seemed to work much better because at that time my brain had had a chance to warm up. But the early morning sessions were good too. They were a challenge, and I really do like a challenge. After a while, I felt very comfortable speaking to my teacher, and we had topics that we both enjoyed discussing. So I felt I could do with some input from elsewhere, from another speaker, to get a wider range of speaker styles and vocabulary. This is just like when working on the grammar of Musa 10 for my PhD, where I needed to get input from a wide range of speakers to capture the language. Of course, I was already getting a lot of different input through films and the like, but I felt that a more regular exchange with another speaker could be useful. I was continuing my lessons with my original teacher, of course. At the time, I had just paid a small subscription to one of the podcast hosts that I enjoyed listening to. He immediately contacted me and said hello. I had not expected that. I wrote back and we started a conversation. I ended up asking him if he was interested in being my teacher for a short period of time, and we had a trial lesson. He insisted it would have to be complimentary. He didn't want any money. He seemed to be a really nice person, and on top of that had a great sense of humor. I'd actually enjoyed that humor already when listening to his podcasts. We got on very well, so I signed up to lessons with him online as well. 1 lesson every 2 weeks. I managed to fit that into my busy schedule just fine. The things I learned talking with him were very different from those I learned with my older female teacher. He was much younger than me, and he was well versed in slang and internet expressions. He was very knowledgeable about travel in Southeast Asia, and was just overall a really nice person to talk to. These temporary lessons continue to this day, so it turned out to be really useful, and I enjoyed the setup and got a lot out of it. In all of my work with Chinese teachers, though, the classes were really unstructured. I sometimes had topics I would like to discuss, and I know that my teachers would prepare topics to roll out in case our conversation stopped and there was nothing else to talk about. But most of the time our conversation was just free-flowing about the things that were going on in our daily lives. This, I realized, had a number of advantages. I was getting used to talking about things that were relevant to me here and now, so next time I was retelling these things to friends, I had already trialed the topics and learned the vocabulary. There's also the natural ebb and flow of conversations, of negotiating new topics rather than preparing specific topics that I might find boring potentially. Most of the work, really, in preparing the lesson is on me. I don't have any expectations that my teachers will miraculously fill my brain with knowledge. On the contrary, learning happens in my own space. But the teachers afford me a way to get that knowledge out and to talk in the language, to get instant feedback and to speak in a safe space. In both cases, we are using online programs, some that are available both in China and the West, such as Skype, though we've also used WeChat before when the signal was not so good. Using these programs allows the teacher to write in words that are discussed, so I was able to learn the writing alongside, taking notes while in class, as well as having a record of what was discussed in the lessons. I was also keeping a record myself with a notebook into which I was writing all the notes during the lessons, and after the lessons I would go through my notes make annotations, add new vocabulary to my dictionary app's vocabulary list, and so on. When I was occasionally looking over previous lessons' notes, I realized just how easy I found to remember the vocabulary I had learned in these settings, and how utterly useful these lessons were.